This is going to be fascinating. I guarantee it. For all of you who have spent time in your lives, and that's all of you, thinking about the JFK assassination, who did it, who was responsible, what really happened there. Let me tell you, I've just seen a DVD over the weekend, and I don't have a chance to watch much in the way of DVDs. There's so many out there I'd like to, I just don't. I happened to see a copy of this one, and let me tell you, it is quite a magnificent achievement in terms of assembling evidence, not drawing conclusions, but letting you draw the conclusions by simply observing the evidence presented. It's more than compelling. It's stunning, I would say. It is by far the most amazing presentation I've yet seen on the John Kennedy murder in Dallas, in Dealey Plaza. It is called JFK 2, The Bush Connection, a thorough, documented criminal indictment of George Herbert Walker Bush, establishing beyond a reasonable doubt his guilt as a supervisor in the conspiracy to assassinate John Kennedy. That's on the front of the DVD. The producer of this remarkable achievement in documentary making is John Hankey, and John is our guest tonight. Hello, John.
Hey, Jeff. Thank you so much for the kind words.
I speak the truth. It's always easiest for me. I don't like to lie. I was knocked over. I just as a production, I greatly appreciated the understated way you delivered the material and let the viewer decide. You didn't push, you didn't nudge, you didn't do anything except lay it out there. I don't know how you did that much research. I know you've acknowledged others, and we've talked off air about this. First of all, let's give credit where credit is due, and go right into the story of how you produced this.
So you want to know who I stole my ideas from? Is that
No. Here, now let's wait a minute. Now that's a very humble and honorable thing for you to even joke about. But you didn't steal anything. What you did was employed the research of a number of people who have spent decades studying this, and I think without your efforts, their work would fade further and more quickly into the past. I think that they owe you a great debt. There's no plagiarism here. There's nothing but presenting material that actually a multiplicity of people across the spectrum have en masse produced, and you pull it together. And as a producer, I know what it's like to put something together, and you did it brilliantly.
Well, thanks so much. The guy who was the biggest help, I think, to me in terms of focusing on Bush, who put my attention on Bush, was Mark Lane and his book Plausible Denial. And I had heard on some radio broadcast, I'd heard before that this Hoover memo existed in which he named George Bush as a member of the CIA, and I don't remember how much detail they gave, but Mark Lane in the book gives you the entire, he reprints the entire memo so that you get to look at it and see it for yourself, and he doesn't associate the memo with the assassination other than he's placed it in a book that's about the assassination. Mm-hmm. And he doesn't draw attention to the fact that that the memo written by J. Edgar Hoover 3 days after the assassination, written about a meeting that took place at the FBI headquarters the day after the assassination, and the FBI was investigating a rumor that they had supposedly heard that anti-Castro Cubans or anti-Castro groups were going to plan some sort of attack on Cuba as a result of the assassination, and they were supposed to be investigating that. And so the FBI, according to the memo, investigated it, and then they wanted to give the report to the CIA, and the memo names as the CIA member, the single CIA member who was sent to receive the FBI's report on the CIA's work with anti-Castro groups in Cuba and in Miami, was named as George Bush. Lane doesn't draw any attention to the fact that he doesn't draw the connection for you, that he's just spent the entire book describing the evidence against E. Howard Hunt, who was the supervisor of those anti-Castro Cubans and who was named in a Spotlight magazine article as being the subject of another CIA memo from, I think, Jesus Angleton to Richard Helms, in which the CIA memo names Hunt as having been in Dallas and having been involved in the assassination, and on and on and on. So Hunt sued the magazine for slander. Mark Lane represented the magazine, and so he's presented all of this evidence. The jury in that case found, and Lane says this explicitly, in finding the magazine innocent of slander, they had to find that the preponderance of the evidence indicated that Hunt was indeed in Dallas and was indeed involved in the assassination.
Correct.
So Mark Lane lays this all out in the book, but he doesn't draw the connection between what he has laid out in the book and this information that is in this Hoover memo. He just supplies the Hoover memo, and it seems like an afterthought and disconnected. But he gives it to you, and, God bless him for it. I think it's invaluable, and I think, I think that he saw it, but maybe I'm mistaken. I didn't mean to interrupt.
He had
Go
to
ahead.
see it. Maybe I'm just wondering if he put it in there in the way that he did to try to keep some of the heat off of him. I'm not saying he was a coward, but just to let people, hey, here's the key that opens the larger door.
I can't speak to that. He was on with Len Osanek on Black Op Radio just a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, I know Len. Len used to bring Fletcher Prouty on this program many times, and I was very honored to have Fletcher on the program. Yeah.
But so Mark Lane was on, and I thought he was brilliant. I thought he was great. I loved every minute of it. But I don't believe he mentioned this Hoover memo that names George Bush. But he did a great job in presenting the rest of the evidence. And then, if we're giving credit where credit's due, I'd like to give a shout out to the unauthorized biography of George Bush by Webster Tarpley and I think it's Antonin Chaikin.
Anton Chaikin.
Anton, thank you. Which does a really, really excellent job. There are a couple of things in my video that are not covered in that book, but only a couple. It does just a crazy, thorough job in detailing all of the connections between George Bush and the Kennedy assassination, and between George Bush and the CIA.
The amount of material is so huge, it's staggering when you watch this DVD. And a lot of DVDs, as you watch them, you get toward the halfway, 2/3 point, they start to run out of gas. Yours just keeps piling it on. It doesn't slow down.
And it's it's a third the length it would be if I had included. I thought the best thing that I did was editing it out.
Yeah.
Right. I had 40 hours of videotape that I reduced down to about 15 minutes. Right. And I'll give myself props for the fact that I tried to make a video that a person who didn't know anything could pick up and start with.
That's what you did.
I teach high school, and I'm used to encountering that audience, so I try to put it at a level of, and what I say about my students is that they're geniuses, that they're just fabulously brilliant people, but they don't know anything. And so I like to say that the video is addressed to intelligent people who don't know anything about the Kennedy assassination, and so it assumes that you don't know anything and presents you starting with yours first base and their second base.
That was a truly masterful decision to make, and I say that again as I've produced a few things, and it's so accessible. I was watching it and saying, geez, anybody could watch this and be amazed. That you don't have to be informed about any part of the assassination. You just watch it and watch the evidence fall piece by piece into a perfect formation. It's a huge arrow, and it points right to Bush 41.
And I'm going to give a last thanks to Peter Dale Scott. And all he did was set me an example. But way back in the day, during Watergate, I don't know how he got involved, but he ended up on Senator... Well, he wrote a book called The War Conspiracy, or he was in the process of doing it, and so he had done all of this research to show how the Vietnam War had been, in every instance, justified on a lie that was told by the CIA. And he identifies a number of major escalations in the U.S. commitment in Vietnam and shows that each one of those was based on a lie, the Gulf of Tonkin incident being the primary one, but with several others involved. And then the Pentagon Papers came out, and the Pentagon Papers told the lie that Lyndon Johnson and the National Security Council, it was either 3 days or 5 days after the assassination, met, and the Pentagon Papers summary of that meeting says that that Johnson and the National Security Council reaffirmed the policies of the dead president. And Peter Dale Scott doubted that a lot, but all of the memoranda from that meeting were missing, right? The president's supposed to have a copy of the memoranda from that meeting in his files, the vice president and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and all of the members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and all the members of the Security Council were supposed to have a copy of this memo in their files.
Area one to be found.
They were all missing.
All gone.
And so what Scott did...
Stand by, John. John, hold on right there. We have to pause. We'll come back and pick it up just a couple minutes. John Hankey is here. His video, JFK to the Bush Connection, is awesome. Okay, and we're speaking with John Hankey, whose DVD documentary, JFK to the Bush Connection, is just amazing. Did you show that to your class or any of your classes, by the way? I hope you did.
I have been teaching about the Kennedy assassination for 20 years, and it's only been at the end of my career that I was able to piece all this stuff together, and you could ask me that question about how I got into it, but I wanted to finish my point about Peter Dale Scott.
Please do.
But let's say bushkilljfk.com while we're at it. But
that's the other address to the website. Right,
and you can Google it, right? It's available at Google Videos. Anyway, Peter Dale Scott is confronted with the allegation in the Pentagon Papers that that Johnson, when he got in and at his first meeting with the Security Council, reaffirmed all of Kennedy's policies, and that just didn't ring true to him. But what can you do? Because and it also was just enormously suspicious that all of the summarizing memoranda from that meeting were missing in all of the official places that they should have been located.
Missing memos tell no tales.
Yeah, I guess that's right. And so what he did was he said, well, look, when the board of directors of any corporation meets, if you want to know what they decided, all you have to do is gather the letters that the board members wrote in the following week, and they will be directing their underlings to implement the decisions that were made at the meeting. And he particularly got his hands on one from the Secretary of the Navy, which said very explicitly that what the president said, this is our war, and we're going to begin by attacking the North Vietnamese secretly, covertly, and then when they respond, we will then say, oh, look what they did to us in an unprovoked fashion, and therefore... and in addition to which, he went through the Gulf of Tonkin incident with a fine-tooth comb, showing how it was absolutely a fraud. That if you looked at the government's own, if you looked at the Navy and the CIA's own records, it was very, very clearly
beginning to wonder what war in American history, recent American history, hasn't been predicated on fraud.
I think you can say what war in American history, period, but we don't have to go there on this show. I love teaching history. I think that, and unfortunately, I'm 55 years old, and I'm just starting. History's been my favorite subject. I read The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich when I was in the 7th grade, and I'm just starting to feel like I'm getting a handle on how you can look at any incident and then take it back and apply the lessons about the double dealings and the underhanded and the knives in the back and the fraud
and the money
throughout history. But anyway, so what I tried to do with the Bush memo, right? Herbert Hoover writes this memo, signs it, saying that Bush is in the CIA and that he's supervising anti-Castro Cubans who Hoover certainly knew were be involved very, very at the core of the assassination. But then George Bush says, "Oh, that's not me. Must have been some other George Bush." And so I said, "Well, So I said, let's ask the question: what evidence can we assemble to corroborate or to disprove, right? What was Bush doing at the time? Where was he? Was he working in the Caribbean? Was he working with Cubans? Did he have associations with people in the CIA? And what the movie shows is that what the video shows is that he was more thoroughly surrounded by people in the CIA, that he was utterly involved with the Caribbean and with the CIA in the Caribbean, and particularly with E. Howard Hunt. One of the lines in the video is that Hunt's mother is not as well connected to him as George Bush is. It's just absolutely phenomenal. The number of indisputable, in-your-face, major league links between E. Howard Hunt, who is, it's raised judicata. It's been put to a jury, and a jury has found that E. Howard Hunt was, by the preponderance of the evidence, involved in the Kennedy assassination, and then you have George Bush. I wanted to, I think really, it's a point that I should make at the start, and, I've been doing this for 34 years. It was 34 years ago that my best friend showed me a bootleg copy of the Zapruder film, and I realized that although history was my favorite subject, I didn't know anything. And so 34 years ago, I began on the quest to learn some history on my own, since you couldn't do that in school. I tried doing it in school, and it hadn't apparently worked. And so just fairly recently, I'm beginning to get some perspective that I haven't developed in the previous 30 years, that to see the Kennedy assassination as a continuation of World War II. And you had me on before, and I talked to some extent. The evidence that Hitler was a puppet is just absolutely overwhelming, and the evidence of the support of the most powerful people in this country for Hitler before he began, right, just of Nazism, of racism, is just astonishing. My favorite example, and you run into this, and it gets brief mention in a number of places. The IBM and the Holocaust has 2 sentences on the fact. George Bush, the unauthorized biography of George Bush, has a really, really excellent section on it. The fact that the Standard Oil and DuPont developed synthetic gasoline and synthetic rubber, Hitler could not have made World War II without those things. These guys gave the secret formulas to the Nazis and did not give them to the U.S. military.
It's amazing. And I remember.
Hoover caught them.
Yeah.
So another thing is that we don't appreciate what a genius J. Edgar Hoover was. Right, he was an evil guy in many ways, but as an investigator, he was something else.
He was a top cop, no doubt. Stand by. I'll be right back with John Hankey in just a couple minutes. Talking with John Hankey, his second visit to the program, high school teacher in the Los Angeles area, and a true historian. It's interesting how great historians, and I would put you in that class, John, because great historians over a period of time seem to be able to percolate the information and then age it and then see the continuity, the large and small threads that literally weave through the centuries of how history plays itself out. And we do know that the last century has many threads, and you just ticked off a couple of the key ingredients and how and why World War II occurred. And Hitler was an absolute puppet. He didn't have a clue about how he was being manipulated. Maybe he did at the end.
I thought I was just retarded, and I come to this stuff really slow. And that's my observation, is that if you give me enough time, I can usually figure something out, but it just takes me so long. I think, there's some geniuses who look at stuff and they immediately see it. And boy, I ain't one of those.
No, it's so cleverly layered and hidden, and the media covers it up. And things, as you pointed out, memos, news stories, they just disappear.
Oh man, and there's so much that isn't in that video. But I wanted to make one point for sure. Also, it's along the same lines of where I left off, which is that the Rockefellers and the Harrimans are the Morgans and the DuPonts are the evil people in the story, not the Bushes. The Bushes are just there. And I have an example. in 1942, it's one of the major pieces of evidence. It's one of the major themes of the movie is that in 1942, J. Edgar Hoover developed the evidence for an investigation that resulted in the seizing of Union Bank of New York as a Nazi asset under the Trading with the Enemy Act. And Prescott Bush, the president's grandfather, 41's father, was the chief executive officer of that bank. But what I would like people to understand is that he owned one share and that Harriman owned 3,999 shares of the 4,000 shares that were owned by Americans. And then they were involved with Tyson, who was the primary financier of Adolf Hitler, if you believe what Tyson says.
That's Thyssen.
Thank you.
Okay, now, this is all fascinating. The Harriman brothers, the Dulles brothers, there's so many players, and yet there aren't that many players, you know? It's like you could put them all and you could stick them all in one 747. Easy.
Well, you could certainly fit them in Abu Ghraib or Guantanamo, I think.
See, way ahead of me. Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. So Bush, as a tool, as it were, was right there. And we have photographs of him in Dallas now that purport to show him standing in front of a building. I forget which building it was.
I haven't seen any that I found convincing. I mean, the one that I saw.
Yeah, it was a little sketchy, but
it looked like my father, and right, who is tall and has a big forehead and receding hairline, and well, Bush has those things as well. But yeah, I don't know.
How did you keep away from just doing a little bit about his World War II shoot down in the Pacific and what happened to his two crewmen and so forth?
How did I stay away from that?
Yeah, that's an interesting little vignette, but we'll just leave it.
I'll tell you what, I think that if you get up in an airplane and have people shooting at you, I feel a little bit nervous making fun of you, right? That's a lot more courage than, for example, anybody in the White House has.
You have to understand that the man was there. He was an aviator. He was up in combat. But there was a lot of controversy about that. And, you never know in a panic situation what happens. But anyway, it was just a part of the earlier Bush story. And they happened to have color film of him being rescued by an American submarine, which was an interesting little thing to see as well. But it's quite a continuum, the whole story of Bush 41, who continues to this day to wield a huge amount of power. By the way, you mentioned earlier that, it was our guest last hour, that Cheney, who was it, Cheney? I think it was Cheney. Anyway, said that Henry Kissinger had visited the White House more than anyone else, and continues apparently to regularly visit the White House now. And this goes back to World War II, when Cheney was a Jeep driver for American military brass in post-war Germany. But they all have their roots out of World War II. These people. Go ahead.
Did you ask me a question?
No, just rambling here. I'm fascinated by history as well, and all the little threads that come together. I guess maybe if Kissinger has had more visits to the White House, the Bush White House, than anyone, maybe they weren't counting Jeff Gannon. But
let me pick up Kissinger. See, I think that I said it a little while ago that I think that history. Jesus, I'm so ashamed. I'm going to be 55 in a minute, and that it's taken me.
It's your birthday today?
No, not. I mean,
this is 1 minute from now. This guy's turning 55.
No. It's in a few months, but I didn't see all of this stuff. I mean, I've been studying all my life, and like I'm telling you, I've had students who were classified as special ed and who were classified as mentally impaired and who were just really, really bright. And you could discuss anything with them, but you had to give them more time than you gave the average kid. And I feel like I'm sort of that way. But never mind. Moving right along, Kissinger. I think that one of the things that I'm just so delighted about is how I'm starting to be very effective at seeing the parallels between various historical periods. And one of the things about the Kennedy assassination is that They formed the Warren Commission, and the chief investigating officer of the Warren Commission was Allen Dulles, who, by, I think, most measures, was considered to be the architect of the Kennedy assassination. So they took the fox and they put him in charge of the hen house. They took the guy who knew all of the ins and outs, who was intimately familiar with E. Howard Hunt and all of his friends who were in Dallas that day, and they put him in charge of the investigation. Well, I think that it's very interesting that they tried to put Henry Kissinger in charge of the 9/11 investigation.
What an affront.
Well, but what that says to me, I mean, an affront to me, it's like handing me, the
another
newspaper
piece of
banner headline,
another
Kissinger
piece of
was
evidence.
the architect of 9/11.
Yeah, another piece of perfect evidence. Agreed. But
Well,
that was the real message there. You're quite right.
But if 9/11 is the foundation of Bush foreign policy, how can it come as any surprise to us that he makes regular visits to the White House? But
No surprise to me.
I thought we were going to talk about the Kennedy assassination.
We're getting there. Remember, It
Okay.
takes time. Remember,
All
John?
right,
It
okay.
takes time.
You're the
All
boss.
right.
I'm going to relax.
All right, we'll be right back with filmmaker, historian, and great high school teacher. Great teacher, period, John Hankey. Okay, we're back with John Hankey, whose first visit was August 21st in the archives. If you want to hear that, just go back and have a listen. Excellent information. All right, the DVD. The best I've ever seen on the Kennedy assassination. You still there?
Yeah, that was me. Sorry.
All right. So, tell us about it.
Just like that.
You got an hour and 10 minutes.
Okay.
We start out with, let's take it from the top.
Well, I'm used to being asked, how did you get into this?
Yeah, that's too easy.
That's too easy.
How did you get into this?
Well,
You're a teacher. You're a historian. I understand.
And you know what? I think too that it's my favorite way. It may be my best quality as a teacher, which is that I like to start off with a question, and I like to take a question and pursue it to its end, and just see where it goes.
Sure.
And I think that I do that with the movie. I try very, very much to do it with the movie. I do it because I like it, and I find that it's an effective way to look for the truth. I think Galileo did it, and Darwin and the rest of them. There's a lot of good precedent for it. But the way that I mentioned that somebody brought me a copy of the Zapruder film. My best friend got a bootleg copy of the Zapruder film 40 years ago. Jim Garrison, the New Orleans district attorney, subpoenaed the film, and he had to sign in blood that he wouldn't make copies. And of course, that's the first thing that he did, and made as many as he could and passed them around to people who made as many as they could. And so I got my hands on one of those and began. And I was teaching for 20 years, and my favorite thing was I had a NOVA program on Who Shot Kennedy, Walter Cronkite, and I'd show that to my students, and then I'd give them a test and have them just to show them where they were at, what they got out of the movie, and we'd put it on the board so they could see what the impact was on their minds on what they got out of the movie, and then I would take the same program and I would cut out all the crap. Just cut out all of the parts where Cronkite tells you that you didn't just see what you just saw, which is a surprisingly powerful technique. It's surprisingly effective. This video shows you this great stuff, and then Cronkite comes in and tells you that you didn't see it. It didn't happen, and it doesn't mean anything. And it's like I said, the students would be able to see how effective that was, and then we would go back and analyze how it was that happened, and I was pretty satisfied with that lesson. And, it stayed the same for about 10 years. But what happened is that John Kennedy Jr. died, and it was very, very clear to me. It was clear to me that evening that he had been murdered, and we don't have to go into all of that. But I started on that investigation, and I just developed this enormous pile of evidence, which is I have a DVD on that, which hopefully you'll get a chance to look at, and is also available at bushkilledjfk.com. But
right.
So I have all this evidence that he was murdered, but I don't have a clue about how, and I don't have less than a clue about who right? I mean, who were his enemies? It didn't seem like he was not running around looking to make enemies. It didn't seem like, and so I was struggling with that question, and I woke up at like 4 o'clock in the morning, was jolted awake, and I didn't hear a noise, but it seemed like I had, and so, I sat there and listened, and what I heard was my mind telling me that the father killed the father and the son had killed the son. And so I ran to my computer, and I had Dow Jones News Retrieval Service at the time. Not to give them a plug, but that news retrieval service reads 5,000 magazines and newspapers worldwide and gives you access going back 10 years to 5,000 newspapers and magazines. And so I wanted to see where George Bush Jr. was when John Kennedy Jr. died, and he was flipping pancakes in Iowa, and he got on a bus at 9 o'clock in the morning, was flipping pancakes at 8, and got on a bus at 9 and disappeared. And the press went running to him to say, what do you think? What do you think? And they had an angle, right? You're the son of a president. What does the son of a president think of the death of another son of a president? And his staff people hemmed and hawed and couldn't say where he was and could not say when he would be back, and he didn't show up for 3 days.
3 days, gone.
And he was behind in the polls in New Hampshire. It's just, and New Hampshire was a couple of months away. It's just extraordinary that he would pick this particular weekend to disappear for 3 days, right? I mean, very, very prime political hours that were wasted. Well, so then if I was going to make that case, I had to make the case that the father had killed the father, and so then I jumped into all of this stuff, researching, right, aiming at the suspicion that I'd had in the back of my mind based on the Hoover memo that shows up in Mark Lane's plausible denial. I then jumped off into that, and as I said a little bit earlier, I did the research, most of which comes from the unauthorized biography of George Bush, but I got every reputable book and certainly every video on the subject of the Kennedy assassination that I could, and then I had to read Bush's autobiography, and it turns out that Nixon is a very, very key player both in the assassination and in linking the assassination to Bush, so that I had to read Nixon, and I had to read Haldeman, and I had to read Ehrlichman. But anyhow, so I don't know whether we should pick up with Nixon.
It's all in this miraculous production. The material you're hearing, and as it is assembled by John Hankey, you just sit there and it goes tick, perfect.
And some of it's pretty easy stuff. Well, let me throw something at your audience that they have probably heard, but that they never. It's 2 + 2, and they never put the =4 in it, which is that most of them have probably heard that Haldeman said that every time that Nixon said the Bay of Pigs thing, he was talking about the Kennedy assassination, so that Nixon, when he tells the FBI, don't investigate Hunt, it will open up the whole Bay of Pigs thing, he's saying, don't investigate Hunt, it will open up the whole Kennedy assassination. Which means that Nixon knew that Hunt was involved in the Kennedy assassination, which means that Nixon hired a guy that he knew was involved in the Kennedy assassination. And while we're on the subject of Nixon also told the Reader's Digest how he learned about Kennedy being murdered, which was that he was driving into New York City from the airport, and a woman came running out and said it. But then 5 or 6 years later, he told Esquire magazine that a man in the city stopped him on a street corner and said it. So while everybody else on the planet can tell you where they were when they learned that the president had been assassinated, Richard Nixon can't. Interesting thing that E. Howard Hunt can't either. He also had 4 or 5 versions of what he was doing the day that Kennedy was murdered. And, well, so then Nixon hired Hunt. Well, that's enormously suspicious. I have a memo that a lot of people haven't seen before that says it's written to one of the House committees investigating, I think, organized crime, and it says, please excuse Jack Rubenstein from your subpoena. He is currently working for Congressman Richard Nixon. Well, Jack Rubenstein is Jack Ruby. So that Nixon not only employed Hunt, he also employed Jack Ruby, And he also employed John Connolly. Well, John Connolly was sitting in the limousine in front of John Kennedy when he was murdered, and you get to hear the videotape coming out of Connolly's mouth. You also, it's a thing I'll pat myself on the back for. You get to read the lines out of Haldeman's book. I try in every case to hang these guys by their own words, but in any case, Connolly's in the hospital, and he says that he turned around and saw that the president had been hit. But then the Warren Commission discovered that the first shot had missed, and so that Kennedy, that is to say, Connolly says he heard a shot, and he turns around and sees that Kennedy had been hit, and then he turns around, and in the process of turning around, he's also hit, but then they needed him to say, no, you and Kennedy were hit by the magic bullet. You were both hit by the same magic bullet, and therefore you didn't see the president was hit. And so then you have him talking to a bunch of reporters sometime later saying that he didn't see the president. Well, here's a guy who is very clearly a tool of the killers, and Nixon hires him despite the fact that he's a Democrat, and Haldeman says that everybody was flabbergasted. They couldn't have been more shocked, and Haldeman is kind enough. I really suspect that Haldeman was murdered because Haldeman says some really fabulous things, and if you remind me, I'll come right back to that. But anyhow, Haldeman says that everybody was flabbergasted that Connolly was brought in, and then he includes the fact that they called Connolly up and they said, we want you to be our Secretary of the Treasury. And Connolly says, okay, but before you bring me in, you have to bring in George Bush. And the question is, what is the relationship between Connolly and Bush? And so then you go to Bush's autobiography, and you look up John Connolly, and there isn't a word. Connolly was his enemy, as near as you can tell from Bush's autobiography. He doesn't have a kind word. He doesn't have a sympathetic word. They were running for president against each other at the same time. And it's only this rivalry that you can detect from that. Well, then how the hell do you explain what is the connection between Connolly and Hunt and Nixon? Well, I'm sorry, Connolly and Bush and Nixon. Well, one of the connections is that none of them can remember what they were doing on the day that Kennedy was murdered, because Bush, there's an FBI document showing that he called the FBI to report one of his friends as a suspect in the Kennedy assassination, and it says, George Herbert Walker Bush from Midland, Texas. I mean, there's no question about who it is. He doesn't remember making the phone call. Now, all of us, all of the people who weren't involved in the assassination can tell you where. I was in the 6th grade classroom. I was sitting in the back of the room. I was about 8 people back when Sister Mary Patrick came to the door, and she was very disturbed the first time, and she had tears in her eyes when she came the second time. And my teacher was furious for the rest of the year. I have very, very, very clear recollections, but Bush doesn't remember having called the FBI to report somebody on it. Now, I was going to say something about Haldeman.
Yeah, hold on a sec. We have to take a break. We'll
Sure,
come right
no
back.
problem.
You felt that Haldeman had been murdered, and we'll hear that and much more. Talking with John Hankey, who has produced the best, most provocative, amazing video I've ever seen of the Kennedy assassination. And this is a powerful piece of work. You can go to it by clicking on his name, and we'll be right back after the top of the hour news break. Hi, back with John Hankey talking about his masterpiece investigation, DVD production on the JFK assassination, on the Bush 41, George Herbert Walker Bush connection. Connection? More than a connection. Bob Haldeman died in 1993 of what? They say the causes are undisclosed. Somebody has, there's several written accounts saying he had abdominal cancer. His remains were cremated and scattered at a site not revealed, etc. So, you think he was murdered?
Well, let me just tell the story. He and Ehrlichman both, right, died as young men, but it doesn't matter. I'm suspicious. Let me put it that way, and I'll tell you why I'm suspicious, which is that, as I said and as I show in my video, that Haldeman revealed that he thought that when Nixon said the whole Bay of Pigs thing, that he meant the Kennedy assassination. It just seems like that's an extraordinarily explosive piece of truth for him to be handing us, and he handed it to us.
Right.
Haldeman also said that he thought that the CIA had done Watergate, that he thought that the CIA had set Nixon up and that they were out to get him and that they were involved and were behind Watergate. If that's true, and well, never mind, let's just move on. The most interesting thing, I think, is that he also, and this is in the Haldeman Diaries, I'm reading the introduction to the Haldeman Diaries, something I've learned to do as an old man that I never would have done when I was a young history student, because the introductions I find are almost always the most interesting part of the book. But anyway, to a young man, they're boring. It's written by some big league, very, very conservative, some history department chairman. I don't remember the guy's name, and I don't remember where. Mm-hmm. And he's, saying this and that about the book. And then he says, it's interesting, this guy's right in the thick of all this stuff, and there was only one part of the book that was censored for any reason, and it was censored on the grounds of national security. And then he tells you about the part of the book, which is that Nixon, at the height of Watergate, called up Johnson and said, call off your dogs, or I will tell that you tapped my phone during the 1968 election. And Johnson says, if you tell that, I'll tell. Blank. Censored for national security. This guy says that 10 days later Johnson was dead.
Huh.
And it's just, this is when during exactly the same time period that Johnson is telling Cronkite that we ran a murder incorporated down in the Caribbean, and that he didn't believe the Warren Commission. I'm sorry?
Johnson was starting to flap his gums a little too much.
Yes.
Sounds like.
He's lucky he didn't get shot in the mouth like Sam Giancana, who had the same problem. But it isn't clear to me what the relevance is that Johnson died 10 days later. Why bother to mention that? What is that? Right? Haldeman doesn't mention it. How is it relevant? But this guy, and maybe it's only subliminally that he recognizes that this is a key piece of information, that Johnson says something that's so explosive that it's the only thing that was kept out of any of Haldeman's writings, as near as I can tell. Anyway, but now let's take that and look at it hard for a minute, because the History Channel does this thing, and there's a lot of people who are persuaded by it that Johnson was in Texas the night before the assassination, and that he and Hoover were both at Murchison's ranch at a party, and then some woman who claims to be Johnson's mistress says that blah blah this and blah blah that, and people then point and say, well, Johnson was involved in the Kennedy assassination. He was privy to it. And I forget where I ran into it. I think it was on a program on Hoover, that Johnson and Hoover were very, very close. And the first thing, Johnson used to have dinner at Hoover's house all the time, and the first thing that Johnson wanted to know from Hoover was whether any shots had been aimed at him. Well, that seems to suggest to me that Johnson was not involved in it, but especially if Johnson were involved, how could he threaten Nixon about it? But which is just a question, right? And it's the way that I like to approach things. Here's a question: if Johnson was involved, how could he have threatened Nixon with it? But I was just going to move on to another question, which I think is also very, very interesting, and that people are I'm very anxious if people want to send me an email. My email address is at my website. It's down at the bottom. It's info@jfk2 Roman numeral 2.com. But my question is this one: the Bushes are, compared to you and me, they're very, very wealthy people. Compared to the Harrimans and the Rockefellers, they're nothing, right? They're penny ante, two-bit crooks. But as are, right? I mean, so is Halliburton compared to General Electric. Halliburton are two-bit crooks. And, you're barking up the wrong tree if you're looking at Halliburton. But anyhow, the question is, if Prescott's a millionaire, and he was, and if Prescott is a senator, and he was, and if Prescott was, up to his eyeballs in the harem and banking community, and he was, he could have gotten his son the most plum job that he wanted to, cush, 6-hour day, 4-day week, hundreds of thousands of $1950
right.
in a salary, and instead he has his son so on the front lines of the Kennedy assassination, so covered in blood, that he is named in a memo from the director, signed by the director, entitled Assassination of John Kennedy, that then associates him with the anti-Castro groups, of which Hunt, who through judicial process has been found as guilty in the assassination. He's directly tied by the number one law enforcement guy in the country.
Right.
Why would Prescott require these sorts of services from his own son?
Good question.
Well, I have an answer for it, but I maybe should let you and everybody else stew on it for a while. It's a tough question, and it's one that I wrestled with for months and months and months. And then,
so why would Prescott turn his son, George Herbert Walker Bush, into someone who was, as you say, almost covered with blood?
There's no almost about it. I mean, he was so covered with blood that he gets named by the head of the FBI, right? And it's not like this memo was entitled "What We're going to Have for Lunch Next Week" or "Those Darn Cubans." It wasn't, right? It wasn't entitled. The problem with those anti-Castro Cubans, it was entitled "Assassination of John F. Kennedy." And frankly, I think that Hoover hid it in plain sight. But so I'm doing, my response whenever I have a question is just start digging. And, don't look for the answer, because the answer is never where you look. Just start digging. And so I start digging, and I discovered that Bush started running for Senate minutes after the Kennedy assassination, right? That Kennedy wasn't cold.
He announced the next day or something, didn't he? I can't remember.
I you know what, I don't
Anyway, it was
think so.
quite close.
But that's not even the point, right? But it was they are consecutive.
Right. Yeah.
Right? He didn't have a political career before the Kennedy assassination, and he had one very soon after. And he ran for Senate and lost. And, where I come from, you run for election and you lose.
It's kind of time to change careers.
It's kiss of death for many people. Right? One loss is what you get for many people. But not Bush. He ran for Senate
Nixon.
and lost. I'm sorry?
Or Nixon.
And because he had such pull with the Texas Democratic Party, the Texas Democratic Party, which controlled the gerrymandering in Texas, and of which John Connally was the head, gerrymandered him a congressional seat.
Whole new hometown.
He had to find a hometown in the new congressional seat that they gerrymandered him so that it had a very, very solid Republican majority.
I was speaking figuratively, right?
I'm sorry?
I was speaking figuratively.
Of course.
Yeah.
They made him the Republican candidate, and he won. They were able to, in that way, get him to win an election. He then ran for Senate again and lost again, and Nixon picks him up and dusts him off and makes him the ambassador to the United Nations, which is, on the one hand, it's high profile, and on the other hand, it's very low stress. There's, no threats involved. And when Watergate breaks, they ship him off to China to keep him as far away from Watergate as they can, although I'd bet you the money in my bank account, which is almost nothing, that he's deep throat, that he was, right? I mean, he's the guy most closely tied to Hunt. It's one of the things that I mentioned in the video that again, Haldeman says nobody could figure out how Hunt got into the White House. There's nobody in the White House there's one guy who's in CIA, but he's in the information end of CIA. He's one of the guys who goes out and actually finds things out. He's not a dirty trickster. He's not in operations. The only guy anywhere around who is in operations is Bush. And Bush is not only in operations, he's in operations in exactly the same place at exactly the same time as E. Howard Hunt, besides having all of these many connections to Hunt. Many.
Stop right there, John, if you would. And all of this is elaborately and brilliantly laid out in the DVD documentary, which you can get simply by clicking on John's name. It's JFK2, The Bush Connection. Click on it and get it. I highly recommend this one. Be right back.
Literacy level of our children are falling. Your literacy level. Your literacy.
Okay, back with John Hankey talking about his DVD production on the JFK assassination and the involvement of Bush 41. Go ahead, John.
Well, we were asking the question how it is that a millionaire like Prescott Bush could force his son to be so intimately involved, so near the front lines, that he gets named in a memo by J. Edgar Hoover that's entitled Assassination of President John F. Kennedy, and then goes on to practically name E. Howard Hunt, although it only named the what Hoover calls misguided anti-Castro groups. Hoover uses the word misguided anyway. And so, as I said, I didn't have a good answer for that, and so I just started digging, and it suddenly becomes clear to me that Bush's political career was begun with the Kennedy assassination, and that once begun, his success was assured as a result of the Kennedy assassination. And it just struck me that here's a guy who's a made man. And for people who are not familiar with how criminals work, it's not just the mafia. It's also, I taught in the poorest school in Los Angeles, in the city of Los Angeles, in the deepest pit of South Central. And, again, brilliant kids who don't know anything, but boy, they knew about gang life and they knew about how gangs work, and I've learned an awful lot from those guys. And one of the things that I learned is that if you're in a criminal organization and you want to sit down at the table with a bunch of murderers, you have to commit a murder. If they're going to feel free to discuss their business in front of you, if they're going to let you in the room and let you seriously sit down at the table where they're just smoking and drinking, you have to commit a murder. And you have to do it more or less in front of them so that now they can trust you, because they know that you can never rat them out because you have as much, right, you have as much stuff on them as they have on you, so that nobody can blow the whistle on anybody else.
Right.
It struck me that this was the situation, that Bush was a made man, and in order to be a made man, in order to have a future which was absolutely guaranteed, where it didn't matter what happened. I mean, geez, these are the guys I genuinely think that I never realized what a short time Reagan was in office before they tried to assassinate him. And I'm persuaded that they wanted him dead, but in any case, it doesn't really matter, because they made sure, and maybe that was the message to Reagan, but in the unauthorized biography of Bush, the Tarpley makes very, very clear that Reagan doesn't know about any of the stuff that's going on. He's completely unfamiliar with Iran-Contra, and every meeting in which Iran-Contra and the drugs and all the rest of this stuff is discussed is chaired by George Bush, so that they managed to get him into power. He got his ticket punched at the Kennedy assassination. That's my observation. And, so that when... that's the other question. The next question that you then have to ask is, if you're going to choose Georgie, and let me throw in quickly that I think it's very, very obvious, I suppose, to most people that little George Bush is a very, very, very minor player compared to his father, but his father is a minor player compared to Prescott, who is a major league evil person. And that's becoming increasingly clear to me too, is that Prescott was more involved.
You there, John? Somebody got dropped. Okay, let's check and see who's still there. Am I still there? I'm still here, but John got dropped. Okay. All right, we're going to call him right back. So we got a break coming up here. Let me just remind you that the video is in DVD form, JFK, the Bush Connection, that it is laid out in such a way that you come away there just awestruck at the amount of information that points in one direction. Again, you get to do the deciding. Speaking of the decider, this is what John was talking about. The little one compared to his father, compared to Prescott, who was the big one. All right, we got John back. I think we have him back. No, we don't have him back.
Hello, yeah, I'm back.
We do have him back. All right.
Very good.
So we're talking about the little fish, then the bigger fish, then the big fish, Prescott.
Well, and who did little Georgie have to kill to get it? If you're going to let him be the president during 9/11, which is, I mean,
well, all of us remember
that's a tough spot to be in.
Yeah, all of us
right?
remember the look on his face. Reading the book. I mean, that look was unbelievable.
Oh, for example, but I mean, there's several pictures. There's a picture of him sitting at the table with, and they're all wearing their flight jackets because they just dashed into the room to plan the war on terrorism, right? So none of them has on a suit jacket. They all,
right.
Anyway, and he looks like such a lost little boy, and he and Laura are standing. There's a picture of them. They're standing outside the White House, and I'm looking at them thinking, why are they on this lonely hill talking to each other? And they probably know that there's no place in the world that they can go and have a private conversation, that he can't tell her what he really thinks about anything because if his bosses find out, they're liable to kill him for it.
Yeah, and he'll never get to vacation in Paraguay. Or was it Uruguay?
Well,
I can't remember.
In any case, the thing is, if he's going to be your man, if you're going to entrust him to be the president...
Well, it goes back to Skull and Bones, doesn't it? Same kind of thing, in a way. Secret society, get something on each other, and you're all guaranteed to be locked in together.
Okay, but so I mean that's my point. If you're going to let this guy, the person who was president during 9/11, when it's such an obvious crime, when so many millions of people in this country and millions around the world, right? Bush can't leave the country without having people. The reporters were yelling "terrorist" at him in Indonesia. The reporters were screaming terrorist at him, that he had to win their confidence, that he was going to be tough, that he was going to sit this one out, that he was going to not betray them on 9/11, and I think that in order to do that, he had to kill somebody, and the question is who.
It's, I don't know. It's all interesting speculation, and there's a lot of evidence to support it. Be right back in just a couple of minutes. Don't go away. Okay, and back with John Hankey. All right, John, go ahead. It's fascinating just listening.
Well, I think I was kind of done. Unless we jump off into the murder of John Kennedy Jr.,
Oh, we sure can. You've got another entire production out on that, and it's essential, I think, that people understand that. What really bothered me about the murder of John, his wife, and sister-in-law, and apparently one other person, was how easily the American public just choked that down. Kind of just swallowed it. They didn't even choke it down. They just kind of went down. Well, another Kennedy dead, and that's the way it was. And go ahead, tell us more.
Well, I think a lot of people had a real hard time with it.
Well, I did. I'm telling you though, in a larger sense, because of the control of the mainstream media now, the issues that should have been brought up were not, and it just kind of went on by. That's my point, which you make obviously in your DVD, which I haven't seen yet, but we've talked about it.
Right, and hopefully you will, because I put it in the mail to you a couple of days ago.
Thank you.
Well, let me touch on that, and then I'm going to come back to the first John Kennedy assassination, which is that I don't know if you know John DiNardo. His name gets around. Oh, well, very good. Well, John DiNardo is a real hero in the story of the assassination of John Kennedy Jr. in that he contacted the radio station. It was all over the Internet. There were many hits on the Internet that John Kennedy Jr. had contacted the tower at Martha's Vineyard. I believe CNN reported that the ABC affiliate in Boston, WCVB TV, had reported that Kennedy contacted the tower. And so I called them up, and they said no, they hadn't reported that, and I couldn't get the tape. But DiNardo called them up, and he managed to find out how he could get the tape, and so he ordered the tape, and they sent it to him, and it had the main 6 hours cut out. In fact, they introduced the tape that they originally sent him. They introduced Todd Bergen, who was the chief petty officer and spokesperson for the Coast Guard. They introduced him. Mm-hmm. So here comes the information, then it cuts off. This is at about it's about 10:30, 11:30 in the morning and then it cuts to the 6 o'clock news. And he called up the company that produced it and said, hey, I paid for this. You have my money. You cashed my check. You have to give it to me, and they did. So he was able to obtain that. What was I telling you?
A quick sideline. You're just talking about DiNardo and his heroics getting this particular tape of the Coast Guardsman, which was they tried to bury it. But there is a service in every major city in this country that literally records every television station around the clock, and you can buy anything you want from them. They have archives. That's the point, and that's I think where John went to get this this news footage.
The point was that in it, the Pentagon took over the reporting of the news at about 12 o'clock. And
a civilian air crash, Pentagon steps right in. Okay.
Right, takes over the reporting. All the reporters are to show up at the Pentagon, and it's one of these terrorists from People magazine asks a good question, and it just goes blank. They just kill the feed. And so then the local news people have to then fill in the blanks until it comes back on, and when it comes back on, it's a totally new question. But in this, you get, these are the reporters, right? And they went after the Pentagon, right? How the hell come you guys, you mean you don't have the radar information that we have? You mean you're going to continue to scatter the planes all across the Atlantic instead of focusing on the crash area? Don't you have this radar information? They really went after them. But of course, right, who saw it, and the point is that I think that all of us, including, and maybe is me as much as anybody, tend to kick reporters around for not doing their jobs on 9/11, just for example. But I mean, there's a lot of other good examples. The Kennedy assassination. Tom Weicker, it's one of the things that's in the video, is that Tom Weicker, Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter from the New York Times, filed his story, and the New York Times printed it on the day of the assassination. They print the story from Weicker saying that Kennedy had entrance wounds on his throat and on his right temple and a large exit wound in the back of his head. Well, what the hell do you want? I mean, right, here's a reporter who did his job,
right.
But then the people who control the media have their dogs who come in and clean up as soon as they can. But so the point is that the earliest reports, if you have a chance of getting the truth, the earliest reports are where you're going to get the truth. And it was on that basis that I never, in the case of John Kennedy Jr., I never let go of the notion that there was a flight instructor on the plane, because that had been in the earliest report. And I heard that, and then when I got home and I hear... And that story's just gone, right? And you're left to ask yourself, well, am I crazy? Did I just imagine this? Because there's no acknowledgement that the story had been this and the story is now that. There's no acknowledgement that Weicker originally reported that Kennedy had 2 entrance wounds, one on his throat and one on his head. We just don't mention it anymore. There's no acknowledgement by the Pentagon that the Coast Guard reported that John contacted the tower, which means that if he was in contact with the air traffic control, they knew where the plane was in trouble before it hit the water. The system is such
they could have pinpointed that. Of course, they knew right where it went down.
Before it hit the water, they knew. And then and there's all these redundancies, as with 9/11. There's all these redundancies in a system, so that if one fails, there's a backup, and if that one fails, there's a backup. And in the case of the plane, there's 3 redundancies, and all of them had to just go by the wayside. And right, the same thing with the FAA. If a plane gets hijacked, right, there's all of these people who just have to completely go away for the thing to not get dealt with. I was going to go back to the JFK senior video,
right,
and talk about some of the things that I think are the most extraordinary in it. I think one of the most moving, right, there's a whole section on how the Secret Service was on stand down, but one of the most dramatic visual images is of the Secret Service man there's handles, right? There's a close-up, and you get to see that there's handles on the trunk.
Yep.
There were supposed to be 2 guys riding on the back of the limousine.
Mm-hmm.
And the Secret Service man is ordered away from the limousine. He's going to be he's getting ready to jump up and assume his position on the back of the limousine, and his supervisor waves him away. And he gets off and he holds up his hands to say, what the hell's going on? What do you mean I'm not supposed to? Why am I not supposed to do my job?
Yeah, it's truly a moving scene. the whole thing is. It's an extraordinary accomplishment, John, and that your video is going to be around for a long, long time. Back in just a couple minutes, our final segment with historian John Hankey talking about his video production, JFK 2, The Bush Connection. Hi, back with John Hankey. All right, John, go ahead. We have one segment left, and I hope all of you, I don't give endorsements out lightly, and I mean this. You need to see this DVD. You're not going to see anything more compelling. I don't care how many you look at. It's just amazing. And the narration, the way you've done it, is perfect. Just perfect. Go ahead.
Well, you can see it for free at Google Videos, and I'd encourage you to do that, but there's a part 2 to it that's on the DVD that deals with Jeff and I talked a little bit on the phone about just the mountain of evidence that Oswald was not only was he an FBI agent. I mean, in the first meeting of the Warren Commission, the Attorney General of the state of Texas told them that Oswald was a FBI agent. They gave his agent number and they told you what his salary was. Not only was he an agent, but it appears that he was Hoover's top agent in the field, that Hoover's most important job at that time, the one that he was under the most pressure to come through on, was locating the CIA's secret training camps, which had been the proximate cause of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and therefore the proximate cause practically of the destruction of the world. And Oswald, there's all of the circumstantial evidence to suggest that Oswald was an FBI agent, and he was seen at the training camp by Delphine Roberts, who was the secretary of the guy who ran the training camps, Guy Bannister, and that was the individual that they chose to set up for the crime. It was shortly after the raid on these training camps that Oswald was then recruited by the CIA to go to work for them again at the school book depository, again at minimum wage. But you said something about that I wanted to say that my son's 2 years old, and I made this video as much for him as for anybody. It's just such a disaster the way that our history gets stolen from us. My grandfather.
Amen to that.
Yeah, my grandfather had all of this great history in his background, and he died without telling any of his kids any of it. He was a leader of the Pullman strike, right? And the city of Cincinnati there was a pitched battle in the street between the people and the army, over the issues of whether
nobody knows about that anymore. Yeah.
But he hated the Rockefellers, and he knew why. And none of my aunts or uncles or my mother knows any of this stuff because he didn't tell it to any of them. And I really hope that my kids are going to have a different situation, that they're going to have a father who, I worry about things like this, that even if I got killed, that they would have this stuff, this information, and I would encourage people to give it away as a Christmas present to especially the young people who are who are starting out trying to figure out how the world works, to give them at least a place to stand in trying to figure their way out of the forest of lies.
Yeah, this is real gold. This is real history, and it's important.
Well, so let me think 2 seconds.
Yeah, we have about 7 minutes left. So
all right. Well, let me take up another thing that it puzzled me in my studies of the Kennedy assassination, and hardcore. Right? I was going at this pretty good, but I didn't get pushed over the edge to quit doing everything else and focus on this until, as I mentioned earlier, the death of John Kennedy Jr. really made me get serious about it. And so, I had these questions about whether Johnson was involved, and there's, to what extent was the mafia involved, and to what extent, that there's these allegations that the Cubans were involved, and to what extent do any of these parties play an important role? And one of the things that I'm able to establish in the video, there's a guy named David Lifton who's done some very important work, and a couple of things that he did was he was the first one to discover an FBI memo in which the FBI agents who were present at President Kennedy's autopsy said that it was apparent that surgery had been performed on the president's head before the autopsy started. And, of course, these guys have been pressured and have taken it back. No, we didn't mean that. We said it, but we didn't mean it. But then, so what Lifton did is he went down and he interviewed the guy who put Kennedy into the casket in Dallas, and the guy says he wrapped it in sheets and put it into a bronze ceremonial casket, which is what you see when you see videos of the president's body being moved. But then he went to Bethesda, and he interviewed the technicians who unloaded the body, and the body was in a pinkish-gray shipping casket and was in a body bag. There were no sheets. How did it get from the one into the other? Well, all right, so that's a start. If you ask the question, how could surgery have been performed? Well, you see that the body was switched, and that Jackie, who thought she was watching, keeping a very careful watch over the president,
empty casket,
was watching over an empty casket. And then in this NOVA program that I mentioned earlier, that they present all this terrific stuff, and then they tell you that you didn't see that. And in this case, they bring in the Dallas doctors, and they confront them with this question, right? Were the wounds altered? And they bring them in, and they show them the photos, and this one doctor comes out, and he says, well, they're pretty much the same except, and he points to the wound in Kennedy's temple and says, except here, where clearly they have cut the skin and pulled it back. And then Robert Groden is the guy who was the specialist for Oliver Stone, the photographic specialist for Oliver Stone. And somebody, this is the story that he tells, that somebody called him up and told him to look in a particular garbage can, and he went and he looked in it, and he found autopsy photos. And this autopsy photo is in Groden's book, and it's clearly an autopsy photo of Kennedy, and it shows exactly the surgery that the doctor in Dallas was talking about, that the wound on Kennedy's right temple, the wound that was inflicted from the grassy knoll and that blew out the back of his head, as every single medical person in Dallas said, that wound was tampered with. And in the video, you get to see for yourself, and it's very, very obvious.
But it looks as if there was a big triangular cut made to actually remove the hole in the skin, or whatever would appear to be a hole in the skin, the entry point.
And why they would do such a thing is, the reason that they did it is so that Dr. Bodden, this scumbag, could then, so that they could then bevel the edge of the skull, so that it could then appear to be an exit wound, and then they focus, right? They ignore this freaking obvious, what's the word for it, desecration of the body.
Right.
This obvious surgery. I say in the video, it looks like a guy got out his Boy Scout knife. It's very, very
exactly
crude.
what it looks like.
And pulled it back, but they did that so that they could bevel the edge of the skull, so that Bodden could come in and say, "See, the skull is beveled. That's evidence of an exit wound." So I presume that is, well, certainly that's the reason that they did it, in order. But it's a very, very crude attempt. It's a very, very crude attempt. But in any case, what's eminently clear is that it's a crude attempt that was not performed by the Mafia. It's a crude attempt that was not performed by the Cubans or the Russians, and that could only have been performed with the cooperation of the highest levels of the Secret Service and the FBI. And it used to be the evidence that I would point to say that Johnson was guilty. But if you have, if all of the Secret Service agents who were on the plane, or if the commander of the Secret Service agents, who's obviously, this guy's in on it, because you see him waving the guy away from the handles on the back of the limousine. Well, all he has to do is walk into the Air Force One and order the Secret Service men out of the room, while whoever the other people are, yank the body out of the coffin. And how they got it off the plane is a very interesting question, and I don't have a good answer to that, but they obviously did, right? Mm-hmm. There weren't two caskets on the plane, and it arrived in Bethesda in a different casket, and it arrived in Bethesda in not the condition that it was in. But the point of that whole story is that the body was altered, I think, 8 hours before Oswald was even charged. That at the time that Oswald was arrested, there was no evidence connecting him with the assassination. And the point that I make is that the guys who were destroying the evidence of who indeed it was who killed the president, and were doing it 8 hours before the patsy, any evidence had been accumulated against the patsy, or he had even been charged with a crime, are not accessories after the fact. They are not participating in a cover-up. They are participating in, they had to be in accessories before the fact. They had to have been involved. They had to have foreknowledge. This plan had to have been in effect before the assassination took place. And so it shows the involvement of members of the U.S. government at the highest
levels. Sure.
Well, certainly at the highest levels of the Secret Service.
You know, there are a number of people, I wonder how many of them are still alive, who certainly had or have inside information on this. You just don't know. There have been so many people removed, shall we say. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm trying to... occasionally there's somebody who comes forward, but...
we even know the name of the woman who drove the shooters from Florida to Texas. You've got that in there, too.
Yeah, sure. No, that's another outstanding. If you haven't read, for people in your audience, if you haven't read Plausible Denial, Marita Lorenz, Richard Helms gets on the stand in the slander trial of E. Howard Hunt, right? Hunt sued his magazine for slander, and Helms gets on the stand and identifies Marita Lorenz as a CIA agent, and she gets on the stand and says that she's in a hotel room in Dallas, and Oswald is there, and Sturgis is there, and Ruby is there, and Hunt comes walking in and starts passing out maps and money. And she was devastating on cross-examination. Why the CIA was representing E. Howard Hunt, you have to explain for yourself, but the CIA felt compelled to represent E. Howard Hunt, and they asked her, "Oh, really? You were in this station wagon with all these men. Well, who else was in the station wagon?" And she says, "You want me to name the other CIA agents who were in this station wagon?" He says, "Yes." And so she rattles off the names, and I apologize that I don't have those.
That's all right. The video is just it's an instant classic, and I thank you for producing it on behalf of everyone who will ever see it, John. And we'll talk again. Thanks for the time tonight. I appreciate it, and I salute what you've done. Thank you, John.
I'm very, very, very grateful. Thank you so much.
Indeed. Take care.
Okay, you too. Bye-bye.
Good night. John Hankey. And I urge you to get this video. You can see it online on Google and watch it. It's a powerhouse. All right, we're going to pause for 21 hours. Be right back tomorrow night and talk to you then. In the meantime, we'll be with you at rense.com.